This is Asia. The continent has a big problem on its hands. Water security is emerging as an increasingly vital issue for the region. This is with good reason, given that Asia is currently facing a major water crisis. And by major, I mean major.
A record-breaking drought, the longest and most severe drought in recent history.
Millions in Syria and Iraq are facing water shortages.
Activists warn the situation is likely to worsen due to a lack of water resource management.
India, China, Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan alone account for nearly half the world's total groundwater use,
sparking the region's worst water crisis in years.
The water challenges plaguing the region are so severe and so intense that many believe that lack of water, yes, water, if unsolved, will lead to the collapse of Asia as a region. Such sentiments make this headline on the United Nations Asian website ring that much deeper. Okay, no more brooding. Let's get to the facts. What is the Asian water crisis, and what's causing it? Naturally, we'll also explore the potential ways this crisis can be resolved, if at all, and the ramifications that it holds. This is going to be an interesting and thorough. Asian water crisis is exactly what it sounds like: a shortage of water in the Asian region. Asian countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, and Nepal are in positions where the lack of water is posing a real risk to their economies. Right about now, I can hear some of you groaning in disagreement. I bet you're thinking, but Asia has some of the biggest rivers and water bodies. There's no way they can be lacking water. Well, you're right, but then you're also wrong. Confusing? Let me explain. In as much as bodies of water may exist, not all of that water is usable by humans. I'm pretty sure you've heard of sailors dying of thirst whilst out at sea. The seawater is there, but it's not usable. Humans need fresh, clean water. And therein lies the problem. Much like the limited supply of fresh water that sailors can have on a ship, the world's freshwater supply is limited too. You can run out of fresh water, as is the case in many countries right now. You know the vast bodies of water, the seas and oceans that you automatically think of when the word water comes to mind? Well, those cover about 97.5% of the world's water. And well, they're unusable for most things. That leaves the Earth with about 2.5% of the world's water to share. But hey, there's more to that story. Of the 2.5% fresh water, roughly 99% is either trapped in glaciers and ice caps, held as soil moisture, or located in water tables too deep to access. Where does that leave us? Well, with only about 1% of the world's total freshwater supply, a supply that is meant to be consumed by humans and animals. You see, I say all this to highlight just how little fresh water actually exists. And in a minute, you'll see how this ties in with Asia. Now, when looking at fresh water and its global consumption, we need to first explore two concepts: water availability and water access. Defining these terms will show us where Asia is struggling. Okay, so water availability refers to the physical presence of adequate water supplies. It's quite literal, you don't need to fry your brains here. Water access, on the other hand, refers to the ability of people within a particular country or region to actually receive or gain access to clean, fresh water. Again, water access is quite literal. These two concepts are the crucial pillars to which we will examine the water crisis in Asia. You see, water availability may be more dependent on physical or environmental factors. Here, we're talking about things like the geography of a particular country or something like climate change. With water access, it's different. Access may be more dependent on social or political factors. Here I'm referring to how much of a country's agricultural sector is dependent on irrigation, or how effective a country's municipal water supply is. So when we ask the question, are we facing a water crisis? We should actually be framing the question to reflect the problem of availability versus the problem of access. Is the problem water availability in the region, or is it water access? Is Asia simply not receiving enough rainfall? Or is fresh water simply not accessible due to certain practices? Answering these two pillars will help us identify the challenges and ponder the ways that the Asian water crisis can be rectified, or at least bettered. So let's go deep and analyze the first pillar, the availability of water. When you look at Asia as a whole, you'll find that water shortages have become major factors in the economic and social stability of various countries. No two countries better exemplify this concept than China and India. Though China is blessed with numerous freshwater resources, the challenge they face lies in the distribution of these water resources. To put it simply, they are distributed very unevenly, and this results in several regions facing water challenges, whilst other regions don't share the same problems, all within the same country. China's struggles are especially severe. When it comes to China's urban areas, the water problem is especially magnified. How, you ask? Well, of the country's 640 major cities, more than 300 face water shortages. These are urban cities facing water shortages. I don't need to tell you the consequences that this can have on health and societal practices. As for the regions and cities that do currently have water, well, that might not be the case for much longer. This is because clean water is becoming increasingly scarce due to an increase in domestic and industrial pollutants. Pollutants, you may ask? Yes, China is notorious for this. Thousands of tons of pollutants from agricultural, industrial, and municipal sources are dumped into the nation's rivers, lakes, and reservoirs annually. This is not exclusive to China alone, as it's done in several Asian countries, something that is definitely contributing to the water crisis. Using China as a case study for the economical ramifications of this water scarcity will produce figures that will just blow your mind. Due to the water shortages in Chinese cities, it's estimated that $11.2 billion is lost in industrial output each year. That's no small figure. When you factor in the cost to human health of water pollution, those figures combined come to over $15 billion per year. Keyword being per year. As the problem persists, you can only expect these figures to rise even higher. Remember, almost every Asian country is in this position. The figure may change, but the problem persists. In all truthfulness, water scarcity is likely to worsen in Asia in the years ahead. This will have a huge negative impact on food security, as Asian agriculture is already heavily reliant on irrigation, with much of the anticipated increase in food production likely to be dependent on even higher levels of irrigation and irrigation efficiency. I'll dive more in depth into this later. For now, let's look at the second pillar, water access. Now that we've talked about availability, it's time to look at the second pillar, water access. We often generalize to say that whenever there's a water shortage, it's due to the unavailability of water. But many experts state that when people do not have safe drinking water, it's often an issue of access. Sandra Postel, the founding director of the Global Water Policy Project, has stated before, it's a problem of inadequate government investment, of political will, of making it a priority to meet the basic water needs of the poor. It's a solvable problem if we just decide to do it. For the most part, the resources or structures surrounding access to safe, fresh water largely depend on the level of development of that particular country. When it comes to the level of governance and systems that you will find within Asia, industrialized countries like Japan, Singapore, and Taiwan have fewer problems with providing their populations with access to safe, fresh water. In fact, you seldom hear of these countries whenever the Asian water crisis is mentioned. On the other hand, we have countries like China and India with poor systems that result in severe water struggles. The irony is that both of these countries are military superpowers. All we can say when discussing this pillar of water access is that Asian nations need to do better regarding the way their systems work and the roles of the governments in providing a platform that can enable clean, fresh water for everyone. Now that we've had an in-depth look into both the availability and accessibility of water in Asia, the question becomes, what exactly is it that affects these two pillars? What is happening in Asia is highlighting the availability and accessibility of water more profoundly than in other continents. What are the factors that are influencing the water security issue? Let's get into them. When we're talking about water security as a whole, many factors influence the availability of water and access to it. We need to look at some of these key factors in depth so that we can help to identify the problem areas that are plaguing Asia as a continent. Is it just environmental factors, and can we all do something about it? Or is it the social and political factors, and they can be rectified through administrative security, and most importantly, how they affect economic matters and food security in the Asian region? Obviously, the first thing that gets affected when water supplies become a problem is food security. In fact, in a region where the population is densely populated, like Asia, food is always a priority. Due to the water crisis in the region, several experts are warning that food production will likely be seriously constrained by freshwater shortages in the next century. When you think about the demand for food and the stress that it provides on agriculture and its growth, you will realize that as time moves on, agricultural activities will no doubt suffer. How can you grow food if there's barely sufficient irrigation water? As the populations of Asia continue to rise, so too does the pressure for agricultural products to increase in response to the market's needs. This becomes quite hard as well. Agriculture is extremely dependent on an adequate fresh water supply. So what we have here is a case of experts predicting that the Asian water crisis will worsen in the coming years. Simultaneously, they're saying that the demand for food will increase. So you can see the discrepancy here, right? And it's not that agriculture will be a victim of the water crisis. It's kind of also the reason that the water crisis exists. Let me explain that. The Green Revolution resulted in increased crop yields, but achieved these yields largely through extensive irrigation and with increased reliance on fresh water. Almost 70% of the world's freshwater supply is devoted to agriculture and thus is unavailable for other uses. In Asia, this reliance is even more significant because an estimated 35 to 40% of the region's cultivated land is irrigated, and this area produces over 60% of Asia's total agricultural output. What this shows us is that in Asia, the growing demand for food is a significant factor determining the supply of available fresh water. Once again, let's look at China as a case study. I mean, with all the history we've covered on China, I feel like you would relate better to it. Okay, so it is commonly accepted that with growing population demands, food production will need to be increased dramatically. And given the fact that China is trying to grow its population, well, the demand for agriculture is expected to intensify. To meet the anticipated demand, 70% of the additional food supply in China during the next 25 to 30 years is expected to come from irrigated lands. The problem, however, is that irrigation is expensive, mainly because, well, it's not the most efficient of methods. About half of the water that is used for irrigation is lost to seepage and evaporation. Given that Asian countries like China, Indonesia, India, Korea, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka have above 30% of their total cropland under irrigation, well, this becomes a big problem. This is land that will require fresh water to sustain it, however inefficiently. All this makes the available water for direct human use significantly less. It is a ticking time bomb. To add to the challenge of it all, irrigation can be a powerful tool for expanding crop yields, but it can also be extremely dangerous when mismanaged. What I mean by this is that mismanaging water resources can result in the erosion, waterlogging, and salinization of poorly managed irrigation can also result in water pollution and waterborne diseases. It can all go left pretty quickly. Let's move on to the next factor that influences water security in the region. Aside from agriculture, another big factor that is influencing the state of water security in Asia is the degree of industrialization in the region. What I mean is that industries in general account for roughly 25% of the world's water use. When we factor in industrial countries such as China, the manufacturing hub of the world, that figure scales as high as 50 to 80%. This is why when the drought started in China, factories closed at an alarming rate. And when factories close, I don't have to tell you what this means for the economic output of a nation. However, industrial activity is also a big factor in causing water security concerns, as most industrial activity requires massive amounts of fresh water. This is for use in activities such as boiling, cleaning, air conditioning, cooling, processing, transportation, and energy production. As Asian countries like China maintain and grow their industries, they must use ever greater quantities of water, making the already meager water resources even more strained. In industrialization, however, unlike in agriculture, there is a sliver of hope. Much of the water can be recycled, as very little of it is consumed. In developed industrial countries like China, the primary impetus for water recycling is compliance with pollution laws. Since it is often more economical to comply with pollution laws by recycling water, less is wasted. Unfortunately, some of these practices are not adhered to in poorer Asian countries because the governments don't provide industries with incentives to adopt more efficient water use practices. Consequently, although the amount of water being used for industrial purposes is decreasing in the developed world, it's actually increasing in poorer countries. This further strains freshwater resources in countries already facing rapid urbanization. That is a big part of Asia's problem right now. Water availability earlier and how environmental factors come into play? Yes? All right, good. Then you've been listening. Well, environmental factors can influence water security for a particular region, as is the case with Asia. Many countries throughout the world routinely dump human and industrial waste into their rivers and lakes. In developing countries, roughly 90 to 95% of all domestic sewage and 75% of all industrial waste are discharged into surface waters without any treatment. Asia, in particular, is insanely notorious for its water pollution, and that is a major factor behind the dwindling availability of its fresh water. Take South Korea, for example. Did you know that more than 300 factories along the Naktung River illegally discharge toxic waste directly into the river? Or maybe take China, our go-to case study. Nearly 3/4 of the nation's rivers are so badly polluted that they no longer support fish life. And if you thought water pollution was bad in China, wait till you take a look at India. Millions actually die annually because of water pollution in the nation. It's not surprising given that all of India's 14 major rivers are polluted, primarily because they transport 50 million cubic meters of untreated sewage into India's coastal waters every year. New Delhi alone is responsible for dumping more than 200 million liters of raw sewage and 20 million liters of industrial waste into the Yamuna River as it passes through the city on its way to the Ganges. Imagine that. The same trend can be seen in many Southeast Asian countries. In Malaysia and Thailand, pollutants in those nations' rivers, such as pathogens, heavy metals, and various poisons from industry and agriculture, regularly exceed government standards by 30 to 100 times. I mean, it's no wonder why we have an Asian water crisis. But those are not the only environmental factors at play. When it comes to water security in Asia, global warming and climate change also play huge factors. For example, as the most recent events in China and parts of Asia have shown, changing weather patterns could result in droughts in areas accustomed to plentiful rainfall and vice versa. These devastating droughts are ravaging South Asia just about every year. The countries most affected include Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. All of them are subject to the most damaging outcomes of droughts, like agricultural land destruction, an increasingly dehydrated population with little access to clean water, and growing social distress. Recently, China had a heat wave followed by a drought that also made water security quite the topic. I made a video about it on this channel, so feel free to click the link in the description below to have a look at it. Speaking of environmental factors, land degradation is another factor to consider when it comes to the availability of water. As countries experience greater urbanization and deforestation, less land is available in the nation to absorb and hold water. Degraded land usually has reduced vegetative cover, and the soil is less able to hold water. This results in rainfall causing flash runoff, leading to reduced seepage. Looking at our Asian countries, India is the perfect case study. Land degradation in the nation has resulted in reduced aquifer recharge, even in areas that receive large amounts of annual rainfall. And just so we're all on the same page, aquifer recharge and aquifer storage are man-made processes that convey water underground. This process replenishes groundwater stored in aquifers for beneficial purposes. However, land degradation is limiting their effectiveness in India. China is not that much better either. The water tables in Beijing, beneath the city, are dropping by a rate of roughly 1 to 2 meters a year. To add to this, over 30% of all the city's wells have already been reported to have dried up. I know we've talked about a few things under environmental factors, but there's still one more thing to discuss. It's closely linked to land degradation, and that is deforestation. Deforestation is rife in Asia, with the continent losing its forest cover to shrinking by 1% a year. According to Earth.org, Southeast Asia has lost more than half of its original forest cover, causing what some experts argue to be one of the most severe biodiversity loss crises. These experts warn over 40% of the region's biodiversity will be extinct or completely disappear by 2100, should current deforestation activity continue. And as much as 2100 sounds far, time moves pretty quickly. I mean, it's just a few decades from now. Looking at another Asian nation, the forests of Indonesia are shrinking at a rate of between 600,000 and 1.3 million hectares per year. This is a consequence of illegal logging and the conversion of forests into large-scale commercial agricultural and timber plantations. Let's look at Cambodia next. In the late 1960s, forests covered over 70% of the country, but now only about half are still in existence. They aren't the only Asian countries to exhibit this either. Similarly, trends can be seen in Thailand, where between 1961 and 1988, forest cover shrank from 55% of the country's land area to 28%. So yes, understand that deforestation is a major factor in water security. It is impossible, or maybe rather fruitless, to look at all the factors influencing water security and not talk about humans and demographics. At the beginning of the 20th century, the world's population was roughly 1.6 billion people. But at the present date, the global population is 8 billion. Asia's population alone is 4.7 billion. That is a lot of mouths to feed. This, no doubt, adds to the challenge for water security in the region. Now that we've covered the factors that are influencing the water crisis, we need to understand that there are geopolitical ramifications that come as a result of shortages of water. Let's take a look at that in depth. With the scarcity of water in the region, there is bound to be some sort of conflict in the region, seeing as several Asian countries share the same water sources. Most disputes between nations over fresh water resources are not likely to spark violent conflict. However, the tensions can have long-lasting and destabilizing effects on regional and international security. Let's take a look at two such cases to highlight this better. For several years, India and Bangladesh have exchanged sharp accusations over shared river resources. In 1993, tensions between India and Bangladesh boiled over when the dry season flow of the Ganges River reached severely low levels and resulted in crop losses in Bangladesh. Later, in October of 1995, the Bangladesh Prime Minister delivered an address to the United Nations in which she called India's diversion of river water near the border a gross violation of human rights and justice. India's establishment of the Farakka barrage on the Ganges River near the border with Bangladesh has also sparked conflict and disagreement between the two nations. India's purpose in building the barrage was to divert water from the Calcutta port, but Bangladesh contends that such diversion has resulted in falling water tables and greater water salinity downstream for Bangladesh. Naturally, this situation has caused severe tensions and fractures in international relations between the nations. And much like any other international conflict, each country has a different perspective on the matter, and this makes agreements difficult. But in 1996, the Treaty on the Sharing of Waters of the Ganga was signed between the two nations as a middle ground. Since the treaty was signed, there has been relative peace between the two, but Bangladesh still voices concerns. And what we all fear when it comes to international relations is that, though it may start as a water issue, it can quickly evolve into something else. This is just one case, but there are constant conflicts throughout the region that happen because of water concerns. India and China have had several issues when it comes to the sharing of water resources. These have further fueled the tension between the two nations. Take a look at this video that I made a few weeks back detailing the struggles between these two nations. If the water crisis in the Asian region persists, matters could quickly devolve into something else. So, at the end of the day, what do we have? We have a region that has over 4.7 billion people that are struggling to keep up with water demands. Struggling is a generous word, I guess. Asia is in a crisis that is influenced by several factors that we've discussed. Whether the leaders of the region address these issues seriously, well, it's yet to be seen. But one thing is for sure. Lives and livelihoods are at stake. Failure to curb this crisis is definitely not an option.